So a lot of people on the left don't want to hear this, but during the administration of President Obama, I and several others warned that Democrats were taking the authoritarian structures built up by George W. Bush and adding levels of oppression on the foundation that was already laid. So President Obama was the one who took the unprecedented step of droning to death an American citizen, Anwar al-Awlaki, and his teenage son in Yemen, which had never happened before. It was Obama who promised to close Guantanamo as part of his campaign agenda and then built it up a mere 6 months later in an expansion that I witnessed as a journalist. It was Obama whose lawyers argued for the right to imprison journalist Chris Hedges without charge or trial, and by extension all journalists or any American citizen under the 2012 National Defense Authorization Act, which was and is a shocking piece of legislation that allows the president to detain anyone indefinitely without charge or trial. It was Obama who presided over the violent, coordinated 2011 crackdown by the Department of Homeland Security against Occupy Wall Street, which could have been a dress rehearsal for today's even more escalated violence against protesters. And I just want to note, in the last update about this, I shared that this is so nonpartisan and that the left and the right are both using the tools of fascism right now, and that the violence of protesters always creates an easier access to fascism and always plays into the hands of those who are trying to kill democracy. So the war on whistleblowers intensified under President Obama's Department of Justice. He prosecuted reporters such as the New York Times' James Risen. He advanced the prosecution of Chelsea Manning. President Obama went after more people under the Espionage Act than had any previous president, according to the Committee to Protect Journalists. Examples of his push to build up further the structures of fascism that he had inherited from George W. Bush could go on and on. But since he was a telegenic Democrat with an uplifting rhetorical style, not to mention the otherwise inspiring fact that he was our first president of color, these abuses of democratic processes went disregarded by the left and by most mainstream media. And I am really going to say the chickens have come home to roost. This is karma. I mean, I'm not saying the left did it, but the left didn't object when the next level of the fascist monument was built up by our guy. So the problem with fascistic processes and institutions being built up is that then they're there for the next president, the one you don't like, the one you didn't vote for, to use and to abuse. And so here we are. So obviously we are in an endgame, a catastrophic slide to lasting authoritarianism, again, unless we stop it. So I'm going to always say, there is hope, but it's up to us. And then at a certain point, as I said last time, and always, at a certain point there isn't hope. I'm just going to be honest with you. There isn't hope without bloody civil war, other forms of violence. We have very little time before we reach a point of no return. As I've often pointed out, democracies don't close arithmetically, but geometrically. That is, there is a slow slide during which citizens can indeed turn events in another direction using democracy itself. But then in the playbook of fascism, there will be a sudden coordinated shock after which no return is possible. History shows it's extraordinarily difficult for a nation or a people to retrieve a collapsed democratic civil society that recently had a rule of law once it's gone. Even then, bloodshed, arrests, suppression, and anguish are the future, often for years or for generations. So in the interest of avoiding that at all costs, I'm saying what the playbook holds, so we might avoid that desperate future still. And in the last section of these 3 talks, I'll explain how the very real coronavirus crisis is being used to move things more rapidly along. So President Trump did not have to, quote, invoke a terrifying internal and external enemy, which is step 1 of the 10 steps. When he took office, ISIS was the real and terrifying threat that was also invoked to justify the erasure of our liberties. But since March 2020, the COVID pandemic has served in that useful role for both left and right, and as you may have noticed, has totally eclipsed ISIS fears. We don't read about ISIS anymore. What happened to them? Who knows? They are no longer under every bed. It's not to say they didn't exist or they are not real, a point that is often taken out of context by critics who are trying to undermine what I'm trying to tell you. But it does mean that you should notice that ISIS was such a scary, scary, scary looming threat. And now that the coronavirus is the perfect cover for authoritarianism, as we'll see, we really don't hear about ISIS because its role isn't as significant for retaining power. Neither Trump nor Biden needs to create secret violent prisons, which is step 2, as Guantanamo is still open. But Trump has turned ICE into a steward of prisons without accountability, which even members of Congress cannot enter. And he often showcases that members of Congress aren't allowed in to check on children or to enter facilities. He's made a spectacle of separating families, losing children, leaving people in real photo ops to sleep on hard floors with tinfoil blankets, none of which would pass International Red Cross inspection. Bill Moyers noted that agents of Custom and Border Patrol wearing military uniforms were deployed violently to constrain protests in Portland and in Chicago. Quote, Trump is turning the officers of the executive branch into the president's private army, he said. So again, that's typical of step 2 in a closing democracy. The would-be tyrant uses secret police and uses militias who are not answerable to the people. This militarization of domestic police forces and the brutality of incarceration, which started under George W. Bush but also escalated under Obama, means that the violent arrest and unaccountable prison experience is no longer offshored in Guantanamo, it's come to our own shores. So these violent militias, replete with confirmed infiltrators and provocateurs, exist now on both sides of the political divide, but this bilateral violence is good for would-be tyrants. They like it. In a closing society, instability and provocation are both useful. To autocrats, we get scared. We don't join protest. We stay home. In a closing society, this is an excuse for the declaration of a state of emergency and consequent suspension of the rule of law, which is the goal of a would-be dictator on the left or on the right. Step 4 is to set up an internal surveillance system. The COVID pandemic allows for this with track and trace, a development that we will address in the essay after this one. But a surveillance system is being set up. The contracts are being handed out. Your DNA is being taken by Google every time you get a coronavirus test. If you go to Rite Aid, I've documented this, and that data is being sold. It violates or bypasses HIPAA law, and so a social map is being created. McKinsey has one of the contracts, so that you not only where you're going, but where your family is going, where your friends are going, who has relationships with whom, that's all being tracked. Step 5 is to infiltrate and harass citizens groups. It's really not necessary any longer, as people gathering in groups has been broken apart by coronavirus policies. The COVID-19 lockdown has basically suspended citizens groups. People can wear masks briefly to gather and protest, but the ban on gathering of groups of more than 6 or more than 10, depending on where you are, pretty much takes care of any effective confidential citizen activism. So lockdown is incredibly useful in Australia, in Britain, in Spain, in the United States, in Canada, for doing away with democracy, because people gathering to protest is one of the most powerful ways to create change, and now that's been effectively undone as a useful way for people to convene and disrupt business as usual. It's not allowed in some cases in Australia, which I always see these days as a petri dish for policies that are being tested and then exported in advanced democracies to close them down. People are getting tickets from police if they're out for more than an hour of exercise every day. It's you know, some buildings full of people are being held inside at gunpoint. by police. Or I'm sorry, I need to check that, but they're being held by police inside. I'm not sure what level of weapons are involved, but I know that they're being detained effectively inside their own homes, though they're innocent, and coronavirus is the excuse. Step 6 is to engage in arbitrary detention and release. And in Portland, Oregon, quote, personal accounts and multiple videos posted online show officers driving up to people, detaining individuals with no explanation about why they're being arrested and driving off. And as I said in The End of America, when you want to close an open society, you don't detain, arrest, and process people with normal judicial processes. You detain them, scare the hell out of them, and let them go. Detain them, scare them, let them go. Hitler did this, Mussolini did this, Stalin did it, Pinochet did it. It's done in China. Every closing society has arbitrary detention and release. Step 7 is to target key individuals. And again, this step is really less necessary with the coronavirus pandemic because think about how coronavirus restrictions are working now. They're keeping new leaders from arising to move populations. And they're really keeping new ideas from circulating in face-to-face private communications to activate groups in a sustained way. Everything's online, which means everything is subject to surveillance. I don't think people really understand that. Who owns Zoom, right? Who owns TikTok? Who owns WhatsApp? I mean, everything you do that's not in a private face-to-face communication can be monitored. And if you talk to individual influencers like Marianne Williamson, who ran for president, she often speaks about how words were put in her mouth. She was made to sound loopy. She was marginalized by smear campaigns, essentially. Over and over and over again, influencers experience these kinds of reputational attacks. So fear of retribution for speech then, in the wake of these attacks, chills leadership and dissent in closing society. But again, the coronavirus crisis intensifies this weakening of democracy because new ideas and leaders are constrained from reaching audiences because we're all dependent on digital algorithms now. And if the lockdown lasts indefinitely and existing leaders are attacked and undermined, eventually the people will have no one to whom to turn when the final would-be shock takes place. So that's another reason that lockdown is very, very dangerous for democracy, right? Twitter can turn up or down the volume on any leader. Facebook can turn up or down the volume of any leader. And if we can't wander in the streets and encounter one another, or have meetings, or share information face to face, really leaders can be manufactured and erased, and we're completely subject to what digital algorithms decide we should be able to hear or not hear.